Welcome back. Like I said in the last video, I worked on the teleportation. I not only added teleportation, I improved the objects in general. Additionally, I added background music to my game. Now it starts to feel a bit like a game, although you still can't do much with it. But let's start from the beginning, with the objects. I have a text file for each map where all objects are listed. This is an example of an object. The first two numbers represent the texture the object has. If the two numbers are the same, then it is a stationary object. If the numbers differ, it is animated. This one is fire and goes through the sprite 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4 and so on. The next two numbers are the coordinates on the screen. Then follow the size and position of the hitbox, which is done with 4 numbers. The number after that is for the set position. Currently I don't do anything with it, but it is intended for flying enemies or jumping. With that you could jump over fences or other fancy things like this. Then follow the type of object. Each type can have a maximum of 5 attributes. I needed 5 attributes because of the teleportation. This object here is a fireplace and has only 2 attributes. The damage of the burning effect and the duration in milliseconds. When it comes to the teleportation circle, everything is pretty much the same. Only the attributes of the objects are different. They contain region, map, X and Y position and the direction the player is facing. The direction is mostly pointless since the player is moving and overrides it within a fraction of a second. But for the initial loading of the map you can still see a difference as the player hasn't touched the keyboard yet. So far I told you what kind of data is stored in an object, but of course the game needs to do stuff with that information, and that is done in the player movement function. The very first step in that function is getting information on which direction the player is moving towards, and when we know that, the real calculation can start. Since the X and Y direction does pretty much the same thing, I threw everything in a for loop and go through the same code twice. With the for loop, the first thing I do is move the player according to his speed. Here I also check that the player doesn't overstep the boundary of the map. After that I create a rectangle on the new position of the player. I do that because there is a nifty function called collideRect. That function can check if 2 rectangles are overlapping. With the newly created player hitbox, I loop through all the object hitboxes and look if the new position collides with any of them. When there is a collision, I check for which type of object this is. When it is a solid object, then I move the player back to the previous position. When it is a fire pit, I keep the player at this new position, but I set the status effect of burning to the player according to the strength and duration of the attribute of the object. And if it is a teleportation circle, I tell the game where I want to teleport to. After I went through all of that, I permanently set the new position of the player and do the very same thing I just did for the Y-axis. Since I can now jump between different maps, I changed the layout of the maps a little. Now it is more easily recognizable where you are in this world. Perhaps you have noticed that there is music playing in the background. When I change the map within the region, it doesn't change the music, but when I change the region, it changes the music. I also can click on the tutorial for example and hear a different music, but the options page doesn't have any music. This is how I implemented it. First I created a music class. This class calls the Pygame music mixer. Basically it is just a wrapper. A wrapper is a self-written code which does nothing besides calling the code of another person. Wrappers are used to make a more uniform way of function calls, and they can also be used to slightly manipulate data before the other code is called. In my case, the slight manipulation is that I store the path and the name of the music file in the wrapper class. It makes things a tiny bit easier. Perhaps you still remember that when I initialize the game, I add the buttons to the page. As you can see here, I do exactly the same with the music. The text main is the name of the music file. I only need to write that single word and not the entire path and data type, because my music class adds that internally. This has the advantage that it is way more readable, but the disadvantage that I can only play one data type of music and it can only be stored in one specific place. But that is a disadvantage which isn't much of a problem for me. In the game page, I don't just add one music, but one music for each region. This nested for loop has an outer for loop for the region and an inner for loop for the maps within each region. As I want a music for each region, I can just add the music in the outer loop. That way it is called once for each region. Whenever I change the page or the region, I stop the old music, unload it, then I load and start the new music. Of course, there is a check if the current page actually has music added to it. If not, the code obviously does nothing. That is already everything again. Let's see what I will work on next time. Goodbye.